You hear the bells before you see the blood. They rise through the castle like smoke, sweet at first, triumphant, echoing through corridors lined with oil portraits and sharpened steel. The air is scented with rosewater and incense. Ladies in waiting hold their breath behind silk fans. Pages stand still, back straight, waiting for the doors to open. It's a birth. A royal one. The kind that kingdoms fast for. The kind that priests anoint and armies swear oaths over. Behind the oak doors, the queen lies pale and trembling. Her hair soaked, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. A midwife, seasoned and silent, wraps the child in linen stitched with gold thread. A nursemaid bows her head, not in reverence, but in dread. Because something is wrong. The child is quiet, his eyes wide but distant, his fingers curl inward, his breath shallow, his face soft in a way they've never seen before. Not in a prince, not in an heir. There is a pause, a moment not meant for history. No cheering, no proclamation, no fire lit from tower to tower. The physician clears his throat. The queen asks, "Is he whole?" No one answers. You're not just watching this. You're in the room. You can feel the weight settle over every velvet-draped cradle, over every jeweled expectation passed down like a curse. This is no longer a royal birth. It is a royal fracture. Because this child, this infant wrapped in royal linen, is not what they prayed for. His crown has been inherited, but so has something else. Something unnamed. Something feared. The nursemaid sees it first. A tilt to the eyes. A slowness in the breath. The midwife sees it next, but does not speak. The physician folds the blanket tighter, as if shame can be hidden behind fabric. This child will never lead an army, will never sit a throne, will never be shown to the crowd on the balcony. Not because he cannot love or smile or breathe, but because he does not fit the myth. In this world, kings are not born with almond eyes. Queens do not birth children who move too slowly, or speak too softly, or love too openly. In this world, divinity must be flawless, and anything else is locked away. So the doors close, the bells stop, and the child is carried out, through a back corridor, down stone steps no royal foot was ever meant to tread. There will be no portrait, no record, no mourning when the time comes, because this child, born of blood and crown, has been judged unfit to be seen, not by the heavens, but by the family that feared what the heavens might reveal. If stories like this still feel forbidden, it's because they were meant to be. If you believe these children deserve to be remembered, subscribe now. And if you won't, at least tell us why in the comments. Don't let silence bury them twice. They told themselves it was for the good of the realm. One imperfection, one visible crack, could unravel an entire dynasty. A child born different was not just a personal sorrow. It was a cosmic threat, a challenge to the sacred order that monarchies claimed to uphold. Because in the world of kings and queens, blood was more than blood. It was prophecy. It was proof. The crown did not rest on heads by chance. It was bestowed by divine right, carved by the will of God, blessed by relics and rituals older than the throne itself. So when a child was born with a face that did not mirror that sanctity, when the features were softer, the gaze slower, the body weaker, it was not seen as a birth defect. It was seen as heresy. You weren't supposed to question the crown. But a child like that was a question. One that no monarch wanted to answer. In Tudor England, there are stories, never printed, only whispered, of an unnamed daughter born to a noble house, sent away before her second week. No funeral, no mention in the records, just a silence too carefully preserved to be natural. In Bourbon, France, a cradle was once paraded through the streets, veiled in lace, carried by guards, while the real child, the one born with a misshapen skull and limp limbs, was already on his way to a monastery in the Pyrenees, under a different name. In Imperial Japan, infants born with deformities were said to carry ancestral shame. Some were passed to distant temples under the label of spirit-touched. Others simply disappeared. These were not isolated cruelties. They were the system working as intended. Royalty had woven itself into the heavens. Monarchs did not just rule, they represented. A king's body was the body of the nation. A queen's womb was the vessel of order. If that order failed, if the body betrayed its role, then the illusion fractured. An illusion was everything. There was no understanding of chromosomes. No science to explain that this was not a curse, but an extra thread in the human fabric. To them it was punishment, a divine rebuke, a stain from a sin too secret to speak. So they erased the evidence. Midwives were paid. Nurses sworn to silence. The child was replaced in public memory by another, a cousin, a second sibling, or a fiction altogether. The original was sent to a convent, or a distant estate, or left to die slowly in a chamber no one visited. It wasn't called murder. It was called mercy, because mercy in their eyes was preserving the myth. And in the royal courts of Europe and Asia alike, the myth was everything. If you're watching this and think this is just history, consider what was lost. These weren't symbols. These were children. Children stripped of name, of place, of voice. If that unsettles you, good. It should. If you believe even one of those erased lives deserves to be spoken aloud, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. And if you can sit through this and stay silent, at least say why. Say it in the comments. These children were denied the world's voice. Don't deny them yours. They were not demons, not curses, not omens in flesh. They were children. But try telling that to a world that had no language for what they saw. In the quiet spaces of castles and cloisters, these infants were examined not by physicians, but by priests, by whispering women, by terrified mothers clutching rosaries or ancestral charms. They looked for marks, for signs, for explanations that fit within the limits of fear. And when they found none, they filled the silence with superstition. Today we know the truth. Down syndrome, once feared as a punishment, is simply a variation, a genetic echo, an extra copy of chromosome 21, woven into the cells at conception. 3 strands instead of 2, that's all. But back then, they didn't count chromosomes. They counted sins. They searched the mother's lineage, her prayers, her purity. They asked what she had done, or worse, who she had been with. The features they saw, the almond-shaped eyes, the flatter bridge of the nose, the smaller ears, these were not understood as genetic traits. They were interpreted as deformities, as signs of divine displeasure, as proof that the bloodline had faltered. They didn't see the gentleness in those eyes. They didn't feel the warmth in those hands. They didn't wait to hear the laughter, the mimicry, the moments of light. They saw delay. They saw difference. And they condemned it. The low muscle tone, hypotonia, made the infant's limbs soft, unresisting. The tongue might protrude slightly, the reflexes slower, the milestones delayed. They would take longer to sit up, to walk, to speak. But they would speak. They would walk. They would smile, often sooner and brighter than their siblings. They would recognize love, mirror affection, seek rhythm, respond to music, grasp tightly to any hand that would hold them. But no one held them long enough to see it, because royal families weren't waiting for smiles. They were waiting for heirs, for posture, precision, fluency, strength, not empathy, not joy, not softness. And so these children, who might have grown into kind and loving souls, were judged within days, sometimes within hours. They were written off not because they were incapable, but because their value had already been decided by the symmetry of their faces and the speed of their speech. Even now, centuries later, we do the same. We claim progress, but how many still use the word burden behind closed doors? How many still flinch at the idea of raising a child who does not fit the mold? Even today, children with Down syndrome are underestimated, sidelined, pitted instead of seen. Now imagine them in the age of divine kings and bloodline obsession. There was no chance, no learning plan, no inclusion, no patience. A child with Down syndrome was not allowed to become anything. They were sealed off from the world before the world could even see who they were. If you've listened this far, you already know this isn't just a lesson in biology. It's a lesson in blindness, in cruelty disguised as tradition. If you have the strength to name what others hid, then subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. And if you won't, tell us why. Say it where the world can see. Say what they never let those children say. There are names you will never find in the archives. Not because they died young, but because the world decided they should never have existed at all. Their cradles were carved, but never christened. Their portraits were sketched, but never finished. Their lives were real, yet history swallowed them before they could even be whispered. In 1604, a letter surfaced. Unsigned, its ink faded, its seal broken, describing a child born into the Habsburg court. A boy, it said, with a loose tongue and a gaze that does not hold. The letter, sent in haste to a Carthusian monastery in the Austrian highlands, requested a room for a soul of noble blood who must never be named. No name was given, no date of death recorded, just a delivery of flesh and shame. The monastery's guest book for that year is curiously blank. In Madrid, 1742, a midwife confessed on her deathbed to a priest that she once helped birth a royal infant with a flattened face and hands like small gloves. She said she had barely cleaned the child before an advisor of the crown took him. Still breathing, behind a velvet curtain. The queen never saw him. The king never spoke of him. The baptismal font remained untouched. The next morning, a different child was presented. Rosy, loud, perfect. Born, they said, a day late. A miracle. In St. Petersburg, there's a story told by servants of a czar. They speak of twins. The one who lived was groomed to rule. The other, quieter, slower, hesitant to cry, was hidden in the cellar of a winter palace. They called him the Silent One. The nurses who cared for him were rotated weekly. When he died at 6, they say no priest came. No rites were read. His body was placed in a wooden box, unmarked, and buried beneath the servants' stables. Even his twin was never told. These are not fairy tales. They are fractures in the record, cuts too clean to be accidental. You see it in the dates that don't align. In the missing weeks in royal birth logs. In the sudden appearance of a second cousin who seems too perfectly timed, too hastily legitimized. The truth is not that they died young. The truth is that they were erased before death could even arrive. Some were given away, to nuns, to distant uncles, to orphanages that didn't ask questions. Others were declared stillborn when they weren't. Their deaths were faked so the living would not need to be seen. Their identities destroyed not by time, but by fear. Fear of weakness, fear of ridicule, fear of what a single imperfection might say about 1,000 years of bloodlines. They weren't just hidden, they were unwritten. And the ones who did know, those who cleaned their rooms, who heard their voices in the night, who washed their small clothes behind locked doors, they were bound by silence, paid, threatened, vanished. Even now, entire genealogies list only the children who fit. Not the ones who smiled too softly, not the ones who learned too slowly, not the ones who didn't survive the lie. Some of these children don't even have graves. The only burial they got was in their family's shame. If you feel even a flicker of sorrow, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles and make sure history doesn't repeat this silence. And if you won't subscribe, explain why. These children can't speak. But you can. By the 19th century, the blade had been replaced with something colder. Murder had grown unfashionable. Infanticide no longer whispered behind veils. The world had changed on the surface. Science had crept into royal courts. Medicine had begun to name what superstition once cursed. But cruelty had only changed its costume. Now it wore white coats. Now it answered to wards and asylums. Now, instead of vanishing entirely, the children were hidden in plain sight, under lock and key. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were born into the British royal family. First cousins to Queen Elizabeth II. Daughters of nobility. Blood of kings. But you would not have seen them in parades or portraits or footnotes. Because once it became clear they were different. Slower to speak, quieter, less responsive. They were taken from their home and placed in the Royal Ulswood Hospital in Surrey. Not for treatment, not for education, but for erasure. Their names were struck from family trees. Official records listed them as dead. One died in 1986. The other, in 2014. For decades, they lived in a room that smelled of bleach and boiled cabbage. No royal bedding, no private nurse, no visits from the palace. Just the ticking of industrial clocks and the echo of shoes on tile floors. Ulswood was not a place of healing. It was a warehouse for the inconvenient. Rows of iron beds, windows that did not open fully, uniforms, routines, and silence. The nurses, overworked. The patients, understood only by each other. And yet, within those walls, Nerissa and Catherine lived. They laughed when allowed. They played with toys meant for toddlers even into adulthood. They waited by the doors on Sundays, hoping someone might come. No one did. They were not monsters. They were not threats. They were simply reminders of something the royal image could not contain. What's more disturbing is that in this new age of enlightenment, commoners with disabilities sometimes fared better. Charity homes, poorhouses, even some religious orphanages, though harsh, offered more affection than Ulswood did its royal prisoners. Some poor mothers visited weekly. Some children, though disabled, learned trades, shared meals, were touched, sung to, mourned. But Nerissa and Catherine? They had titles, but not touch. They had lineage, but not love. When their story finally emerged, it was met with disbelief. Not because people thought it was impossible, but because it confirmed what they feared, that in the name of reputation even royalty would abandon their own. They died in institutional beds, not surrounded by family, but by silence, not with legacy, but with linen labels stitched to their uniforms. They were royal, yet they died in hospital beds, untouched by family, unloved by legacy. You may never wear a crown, but you can offer something they never got: remembrance. Subscribe if you believe even the forgotten deserve their names back. Not every royal child born different was abandoned. Some were held, kissed, spoken to in soft voices behind closed doors. But even then, love had limits and walls. And de Gaulle was born in 1928 to Charles and Yvonne de Gaulle, the future president of France. Stoic, iron-jawed, revered, was not expected to show tenderness, let alone devotion to a child with Down syndrome. But he did. He called her Mon Rayon de Soleil, my ray of sunshine. She was raised at home, tucked into her own bed, fed from her mother's hand. Her laughter echoed through the private halls of the family estate, not the echo chambers of a hospital ward. And Charles, he did not flinch from her presence. He sought it. When she died at just 20 years old from pneumonia, something in him shattered. The man who faced Hitler without blinking wept for her. And in her memory, his wife Yvonne founded La Fondation and de Gaulle, a home for children with disabilities, a sanctuary born from silence. It was rare, and it was real, but it was not freedom, because, and for all the love she received, was still a secret to the world. She didn't appear at state dinners. She wasn't on the steps of the Élysée. She wasn't allowed to speak for herself beyond the family gates. She was cherished, but still hidden, and she wasn't the only one. In 1915, Alexandrine of Prussia was born to Crown Prince Wilhelm, the heir to the German Empire. She too bore the signs: the gentler gaze, the slower walk, the quiet disposition that royalty could not parade. Her family didn't exile her. She appeared in a few family portraits, blended into backgrounds, smiling faintly. She was educated at home, taken on walks, allowed to exist but never to represent. She lived her life under soft confinement, not in a cell but in an expectation. You may stay, but you must not be seen. This was the unspoken contract of royal mercy. You may be loved, but only quietly. You may be protected, but not presented. You may exist, but never matter, because acceptance in royal families was always conditional, on silence, on shadows, on containment. Even when the knife was spared, the curtain was not lifted. The world was not allowed to witness the full spectrum of their humanity, because love, when filtered through fear, becomes just another form of hiding. They were loved, but not seen. Loved, but still kept from the world like a mistake. If you're watching this far, it means you care. Prove it. subscribe. Give them the dignity of being remembered by name. And if not, have the courage to say why. It would be comforting to think this was only a European tragedy, a relic of Western monarchies and their cold, gilded standards. But the truth is far broader, and far more damning. Across continents, beneath different crowns and different gods, the same judgment echoed. A child who did not meet the mold was not a child, they were a blemish. And royalty, above all else, was obsessed with unblemished image. In the royal courts of Siam, what is now Thailand, there's a story, whispered even within palace walls, of a princess born in the early 1900s with unusual features. The official birth record listed only the mother's name. No infant, no time. The next month, a fire conveniently destroyed a wing of the royal archives. Her name never appeared again. Only rumors remained, that a girl with almond eyes and a fragile body was raised in a Buddhist monastery 2 provinces away. Her robes dyed a lighter shade than the others, her voice never raised in chant. She lived, but she was erased. In several African kingdoms, tradition held that a child born with visible deformity or cognitive difference was not a person, but a spirit caught between realms. Among some tribes, such children were considered omens, warnings from ancestors or curses from rivals. Royal infants who cried too little or too much, or failed to hold their heads upright were quietly removed. Some were taken into the forest with priests. Some were left in the care of spiritual women who lived outside the village. Others were not spoken of again. It wasn't always hatred. Sometimes it was reverence twisted into ritual. But the result was the same. The child was taken from the world they were born into, and placed into one that would never know their name. In Persia, noble families kept desert estates, homes built not for luxury, but for disappearance. There are references in letters and diaries of summer retreats that were occupied year-round by a single servant and a single occupant, a child who never learned to ride, a daughter who was too gentle for court, a boy who spoke not in words, but in sounds. Some survived into adulthood, wandering courtyards in silence. Others died nameless, their gravestones marked only by date and title, offspring of the House of X. This wasn't Europe. This was global. Crossed language, skin, scripture. The pattern was always the same. If the child did not reflect strength, purity, beauty, or divinity, they were hidden, shamed, removed, and society accepted it. Because society, like monarchy, feared what it could not control. And nothing was harder to control than a life that refused to fit into the perfect frame. No matter the continent, the wealth, the religion, the story repeated. You may be born under a crown, but you will die under a curtain. If this unsettles you, it should. If it angers you, even better. These children were never given a platform. You have one now. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles if you believe their silence deserves to end. And if you won't, then speak up in the comments, say why. Say what they were never allowed to. The tragedy was never in their blood. It was never in their bodies, their slower movements, their softer features, their gentle pace. The tragedy was never in the extra chromosome. It was in us. It was in the priests who looked away, in the mothers forced to sign false certificates, in the kings who nodded and said nothing, in the courtiers who bowed in silence as a newborn was carried through the servant's door instead of the marble hall. It was in the shame we built, layered, codified, made holy. We did not mourn these children because we refused to see them. We did not see them because we feared what they revealed. Not weakness, not imperfection, but truth. That love, when tethered to image, becomes cruelty. That power, when threatened by difference, becomes violence. And what began in palaces has never truly left us. We don't leave infants to die in monasteries anymore. Now we remove them earlier. We call it choice. We call it preventing suffering. But whose suffering do we mean? In modern clinics, the tests arrive before the baby has a name. A shadow on a screen, a few irregular numbers, and suddenly, a life that might have known joy, music, love, belonging, is measured against the scale of convenience, of cost, of perfection. Doctors speak in hushed tones. Parents are nudged. Some are told outright, "This will be hard. Are you sure?" And so, once again, the child is erased before they ever draw breath. It's not hatred. It's something colder. It's the same fear dressed in sterile gloves. It's the same shame, polished now, hidden in the language of concern and responsibility. But the verdict is the same. You are not what we hoped for, and for that you will not be welcomed. Even those who survive face barriers, schools that segregate, stares that linger, opportunities denied because of assumptions made before a word is spoken. This isn't ancient. This is happening now. In every country, behind every curtain of polite society. They told us the world had changed. But listen closely, and you'll hear the same sentence being passed, just in softer tones. Some were killed, some were locked away, and some were just never spoken of again. But now you know. And if you scroll past this without subscribing to Cursed Chronicles, without saying their names, you're no different from those who turned their faces away. So tell us, why won't you subscribe? They deserved more than silence, more than blank lines in royal records, more than forged death certificates and unmarked graves, more than being born into palaces only to be buried in shadows. They deserved arms that didn't recoil, voices that didn't whisper, rooms that didn't lock behind them. They deserved the weight of their own names spoken aloud, without shame, without apology, without erasure. But they were born into dynasties that worshipped perfection. And in those gilded halls, anything that did not reflect the myth was shattered. Not by sword or fire, but by absence. And now you've heard them. You've seen what they were never allowed to show. And that means you can't look away, not without knowing exactly what it costs. You're not just a viewer. You're a witness. And witnesses have power. Every time their story is spoken, the lie that erased them loses strength. Every name remembered is a defiance against centuries of silence. Every click, every comment, every whisper passed forward becomes an act of resistance. They will never be crowned, but they can still be honored. And not by blood, or title, or ceremony, but by truth. So say their names. Say why they mattered. Say what their families were too afraid to. One story remembered is one life reclaimed from the graveyard of invisibility. Don't let them disappear again.